So I'm curious about Laura Ingalls Wilder, and as a little girl, I read all her books, and I think even my sisters read the books to me when I was really little and couldn't read for myself. I've always been curious about her, so I thought I'd read three different articles about her life, and I learned some new things from these articles. So the first one is the Iowa Source, and it's Laura Ingalls Wilder, Her Real Pioneer Life, and it's by Source staff. Little House on the Prairie author Laura Ingalls Wilder was a real-life pioneer girl who endured tornadoes, blizzards, wildfires, malaria, and near starvation. But her books were fictionalized, highly edited accounts of her life. What was the real story? Why did the family leave the house in the big woods? What were her true feelings about Native Americans? What happened in her marriage to Almanzo? How did Laura start writing? Author Caroline Fraser, drawing from letters, diaries, unfinished manuscripts, and interviews, spent years uncovering the true story for her acclaimed biography, Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Wilder's story, writes Fraser in the book's introduction, is broader, stranger, and darker than her books, containing whole chapters she could scarcely bear to examine. Prairie Fires was chosen as one of Amazon's best books of the year, and Booklist called it compelling, beautifully written, and an unforgettable American story. Vivian Gornick of the New Republic wrote, Prairie Fires could not have been published at a more propitious time in our national life. Propitious time in our national life. Fraser is the editor of the Library of America edition of Wilder's Little House books, and her writing has appeared in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Los Angeles Times. Metropolitan Books kindly supplied this interview with Caroline Fraser, and this was a picture of her. Many people feel like they know Laura Ingalls Wilder. Was her real life different from the one she portrayed in the books? One of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is that I came to feel that Laura had almost been loved to death, sort of like a beloved doll or a toy. Between the fictional Laura of the books and the even more heavily fictionalized girl of the TV show, we've tended to lose sight of the fact that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a real person who was complicated and intense. She also is someone whose life opens a window on everything from frontier history and the Plains Indian Wars to the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. Her real life is even more remarkable, and in some ways, the story in her books, which ended at age 18 with her marriage. So this was Laura on her porch of her home in Mansford, Missouri in the early 1900s, and it's a photo courtesy of Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. How did you become interested in Wilder's story? I was a fan as a kid and read the books over and over. They were some of my favorites, especially The Long Winter, which I just loved. They're so absorbing, a world unto themselves, and comforting. That isn't true for all readers, of course, but that was my experience. They meant a lot to me because my family came from immigrant farmers and a covered wagon people. On my mother's side, Swedes and Norwegians who farmed in Minnesota and North Dakota, and my father's side, Germans who farmed about 50 miles from Pepin, Wisconsin, where Laura was born. So Laura's story felt like my story somehow, and I know that generations of other readers have felt the same way. I started writing about Wilder in the early 1900s when a biography of Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, was published. It claimed that Rose was the ghostwriter of the Little House books, and I was curious and kind of skeptical about that. So I started looking at Wilder's handwritten manuscripts. And I ended up writing a long piece about Wilder for the New York Review of Books. Eventually, I edited the Library of America's 2-volume edition of the Little House books and found the history so fascinating I didn't want to stop. What was the most surprising discovery you made during your research for Prairie Fires? There were lots of surprises, including pretty basic things such as the realization of the fact that Wilder, who is so strongly associated with the West, spent most of her adult life in the American South. That became very clear to me when I went to the Ozarks and Mansfield, Missouri for the first time. I don't think the South influenced her work per se, but I do believe that her long exile from her family in the Dakotas helped to inspire the nostalgia for her past in the Little House books, and that was huge. Another startling discovery was the fact that Wilder's daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, was a notorious yellow journalist who taught her mother the tricks of the trade. Lane learned at the foot of a master, Fremont Older, who was the editor of the San Francisco Bulletin and a friend of William Randolph Hearst. Lane wrote an invented autobiography of Charlie Chaplin. He threatened to sue her when she tried to publish it as a book, and as well as dubious biographies of Henry Ford, Jack London, and Herbert Hoover. The fact that Wilder was influenced by this is shown by one of the very tall tales she told in her famous 1937 Detroit book, Fair Speech, in which she claimed that her father was involved in hunting and executing the Bloody Benders, who were serial killers on the Great Plains. The Benders were real, but her father's exploits weren't. It's interesting because Wilder would insist in that speech and elsewhere that her books, although published as novels, were all true. Why was Wilder's relationship with her daughter Rose so fraught? Rose is just a fascinating character in her own right, colorful, driven, immensely talented, and also kind of tortured. For many years, she was a better known writer than her mother, writing for the Saturday Evening Post and a lot of national magazines. She almost bullied her mother to write the Little House books, and it's clear that they would not have been published without Rose, her professional connections, her editing, and her guidance. I think one of these stories within a story of Prairie Fires is the drama of the relationship between these two women. It's kind of unprecedented. I can't think of another mother-daughter literary collaboration like it. It was sort of battle between the two of them over vision and voice was going to prevail. Whose vision and voice was going to prevail? Rose even went so far as to write two novels of her own based on her mother's material, which Laura did not appreciate. But it was Laura whose voice won out because she was so authentic and it was her story. Their relationship suffered due to their collaboration, I think. Rose, who had lived on her parents' farm for years, ended up moving east and didn't see her father for years before he died. There was a lot of tension there, never resolved. It's kind of ironic that the Little House books, which are so wonderful in portraying a close-knit, loving family, came from such a dysfunctional relationship. What did Wilder think about the expansion of the world of Little House books into popular culture, movies, TVs, toys? Virtually all the adaptations for film and TV happened after Wilder died in 1957. Wilder never owned a television, and she told a friend that she didn't like the one adaptation she saw of The Long Winter. The famous long-running TV show starring and produced and directed by Michael Landon didn't come along until after Wilder and her daughter were both gone. Rose's heir, Roger McBride, optioned the TV rights several years before he ran for president in 1976. McBride, of course, never met Wilder and was not related to her, and I have to think she would have been horrified at the liberties that were taken on that show. She fictionalized her life to some extent, but always tried to be true to her memories. Wilder wasn't completely opposed to products being developed from the books. There was a plan she approved at one point for a clothing line tied to the books, but it never happened. How did Laura feel about the Great Plains? Laura loved wilderness, open space, solitude, and above all, the prairies. And that feeling lifts the Little House books beyond mere storytelling or adventure and gives them a lot of their resonance. I've written before about the relationship between Wilder's descriptions of wildlife and wilderness and the classic American treatment of those topics in Emerson and Thoreau and Willa Cather. She's a classic part of that tradition. What was Wilder's experience with the Native Americans who shared the land with her family as she was growing up? Did this differ from conventional views of other white settlers on the plains at that time? As a child, and this is Laura at the beginning of her career as a farm colonist for the Missouri Rural Rist in 1917. As a child, Laura clearly feared Indians and was also deeply fascinated by them, and it has to be said that she knew nothing about Indian history or culture, or even more about the specific role her family played in displacing the Osage. Her adult view is made up of racist and romantic stereotypes. The Indians in Little House on the Prairie are characters, not characters. That's regrettable, but it also tells us a lot about white settlers and the prevailing attitudes. In Prairie Fires, I tried to bring out some of the historical context for white women's fear of Indians, much of which had to be related to what Wilder called the Minnesota Massacre, now known as the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. It happened a few years before she was born, but clearly influenced how whites saw Indians at that time. I think Wilder's attitude did differ from the standard white view in one key respect, which is that she saw the similarity between Indians and white settlers. They both had to cope with the elements which tended to foster a peculiar kind of stoicism that she very much admired. She appreciated Indians' ability to deal with whatever nature threw at you without whining or complaining or quitting. And she once said of a beautiful river on the Dakota Plains, "If I had been the Indians, I would have scalped more white folks before I ever would have left it," which was kind of extraordinary for a woman of her time. What was Wilder's relationship with her father like? Wilder adored her father, and the feeling was clearly mutual. Laura's sister Mary seems to have taken her after her mother. She was quiet, patient, even pious. But Laura was more rambunctious, hot-tempered, and I think she identified with her father because they were so alike. They both loved solitude, adventure, and wilderness. Charles Ingalls was fun-loving and musical and a great storyteller. He had an incredible gift for playing the fiddle, and though Laura never learned a musical instrument, she had an amazing recall for the songs he used to play. She was one of those people who had a song for every occasion. And they were both gifted writers. We both have a lot of letters written by Charles Ingalls, but the few things we do have are so moving and funny. We don't have a lot of written letters. There was one letter he wrote to his future son-in-law, Almanzo, and his brother Royal when Almanzo and Laura were engaged, and he talks about the prairie winds and the blizzards and how the wind makes his hair stand on end just like in the Little House books. Was the depiction of life on the frontier in the Little House books accurate? It seems to have been very accurate, up to a point. Wilder left out a lot of things, sometimes because she felt they weren't appropriate for children. In the books published during her lifetime, she never even hinted at anything having to do with bodily functions or sexuality. She would have found that distasteful. And then here's a picture of Laura and Almanzo in 1885, shortly after their marriage. In the unpublished manuscript, she left out the first 4 years of her marriage, though she wrote about childbirth in such vivid language that the editors cut some of it before the book came out. But she also left things out to burnish her story. She could describe vividly and memorably how her father built a log cabin or made bullets or cleaned his gun, but she ruthlessly cut entire chapters of their life that did not reflect well on her parents. When you look at Charles Ingalls' actual life, there were a lot of struggles, debts, and even kind of an aimless quality. And she left all of that out. She wrote the Little House books as a memorial to her parents, and she didn't want anything to take away from that. The result, of course, is that the Little House books promote the wonderful image of settlement and homesteading, and much of it is accurate, but the real story is way more complicated. So this article that I'm going to read now about Laura Ingalls Wilder is from biography.com. And I don't see an author, but it says Laura Ingalls Wilder, 1867 to 1957. Pioneer author Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote the autobiographical Little House Kids book series, the basis of the popular television show Little House on the Prairie. Laura Ingalls Wilder published Little House in the Big Woods, the first of her well-known Little House series that eventually spawned the hit TV program Little House on the Prairie in 1932. Wilder finished the last book in 1943. On February 10, 1957, she died at age 90 on her farm in Mansfield, Missouri. In her early life, Wilder was born on February 7, 1867 to Charles and Caroline Ingalls in their log cabin just outside of Pepin, Wisconsin. In her books, Wilder would later come to call the cabin Little House in the Big Woods. 2 years after her birth in 1869, her family moved to Kansas, which would become the setting for her book Little House on the Prairie. She was one of 5 children. She had an older sister named Mary, 2 younger sisters, Carrie and Grace, and a younger brother named Charles, who died at 9 months old. Wilder described her early years as full of sunshine and shadow, and when she was growing up, she and her pioneer family repeatedly moved from one Midwestern town to the next. In 1874, they moved from Wisconsin to Walnut Grove, Minnesota, although the Ingalls family initially stayed in Walnut Grove for only 2 years before a failed crop forced them to move to Burr Oak, Iowa. Walnut Grove became the setting of Little House on the Prairie from 1974 to 1982, a television show based on Laura Wilder's life. In the autumn of 1878, the Ingalls family returned to Walnut Grove. In 1879, they moved yet again, becoming homesteaders in the Dakota Territory and eventually settling in DeSmet, South Dakota. Teaching career. Because they had moved so often, Wilder and her siblings mainly taught themselves and each other. They attended local schools whenever they could. Her decision to become a teacher herself was largely an economic one. Her family needed additional income, especially with Wilder's older sister Mary away at school for the blind. In 1882, Wilder passed the test to obtain her teaching certificate. Just 15 years old, she signed on to teach at a one-room country schoolhouse 12 miles from her parents' home. The first of several teaching jobs. During her time teaching at Bucci School, her parents often sent a family friend named Almanzo Wilder to pick her up and bring her home for weekend visits. Marriage and children. Of course, over the course of these wagon rides home, Laura and Almanzo fell in love, and on August 25, 1885, the two were married at a congregational church in South Dakota. Afterward, Laura quit teaching to raise children and help Almanzo work the farm. In the winter of 1886, Laura gave birth to a daughter, Rose. In 1889, she had a son who tragically died within a month of his birth. Not long after, Almanzo contracted diphtheria and was partially paralyzed, and to make matters worse, in 1890, the Wilders' home burnt to the ground. After 4 years of drifting from place to place in 1894, the Wilders bought a 2-acre farm in the Ozarks of Mansfield, Missouri, on the Rocky Ridge Farm, as they came to call it. The Wilders built a house, raised livestock, and did all their own farm work. Now I'm learning a few things about Laura that I did not know about. My sisters read the books to me as a child, and then I read them myself when I got older. I always loved the books. And whether, her or her daughter wrote them or they wrote them together, the books were still really good. So this next article is more about her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, Pioneer of Liberty, which I found very interesting. And it's by the Legacy staff, and it's from legacy.com. We take a look back at Libertarian pioneer Rose Wilder Lane. I didn't know that. Election after election, we witness bruising political battles between Democrats and Republicans. Examining the history of these parties, one disgruntled independent had this to say: a group of sincere and ardent collectivists seized control of the Democratic Party, used it as a means of grasping federal power, and enthusiastically, from motives which many of them regard as the highest idealism, began to make America over. The Democratic Party is now a political mechanism having a genuine political principle: National Socialism. And this article is published October 30th in 2010. So pretty interesting, given the times we're living in now. The Republican Party remains a political mechanism with no political principle. It does not stand for American individualism. Its leaders continue to play the 70-year-old American professional sport of vote-getting called politics. It may surprise you to learn that these words were penned 3/4 of a century ago by a woman people are more likely to know as Baby Rose from the Little House on the Prairie TV series. When Rose Wilder Lane died October 30th, 1968, the night before she was to embark on a world tour as a reporter for Women's Day magazine, she left behind a remarkable body of writing spanning more than 50 years. Lane made her mark on American literary history by helping shape the Little House books, and this is one reason why so many libertarian candidates appear on ballots nationwide. So how did little baby Rose grow up to be a pioneer female journalist and an inspirational figure for one of the largest political parties in the country? Born December 5th, 1886, Lane was the first and only surviving child of Almanzo and Laura Ingalls Wilder, farmers on the drought-ridden prairie of South Dakota. After years of successive crop failures and tragedies that included the loss of a second child, the burning down of their home, and bouts with diphtheria and stroke, the Wilders lost their farm. Lane would later describe her childhood as a nightmare. Finished with high school and determined to be independent, Lane headed for Kansas City to become a telegrapher. After transferring to California, she met and married Claire Gillette Lane. The couple traveled extensively, selling real estate in California and writing for varied publications to supplement their income. But Lane's writing career didn't take off until she was hired by the San Francisco Bulletin in 1915. 3 years later, the Lanes divorced and Rose Wilder Lane left the Bulletin, become a freelancer. She found a variety of periodicals eager to publish her work, including Sunset, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's, Cosmopolitan, Harper's Weekly, World Traveler, Country Gentleman, and the Saturday Evening Post. Lane knew how to shape a narrative and used literary techniques to breathe life into nonfiction stories. She received acclaim for her fiction work as well, much of it set in the Ozark Mountains of her childhood. Her short story, Innocence, won an O. Henry Prize in 1922, and her novels, Let the Hurricane Roar and Freeland, were published to wide acclaim. A large part of her literary legacy, however, rests on the work she did as behind-the-scenes editor of her mother's work. After Laura Ingalls Wilder's manuscript, Pioneer Girl, written for adults, failed to attract a publisher, Lane suggested refashioning it into a story for children. With Lane's considerable input, Wilder reworked the manuscript into Little House in the Big Woods. Published in 1932, it became wildly popular and launched a book series still in print today and widely considered a classic of American children's literature. The long-running TV series later helped introduce a whole new generation to the Ingalls family. By this time, Lane's writing had allowed her to travel the world as she was witness to the political changes taking place in post-World War I Europe. I am now a fundamentalist American, Lane wrote in 1939 autobiographical sketch. Invigorated with a newfound sense of purpose, she began to make a strong political argument for individual independence and freedom from government interference in the everyday lives of Americans. Her political writing in the Saturday Evening Post, Women's Day, and other publications struck a chord, and though the 1943 printing of Discovery of Freedom ran only 1,000 copies, it so impressed young thinkers of that generation that it's difficult to imagine the Libertarian Party in America being created without it. Despite its influence among people like Robert Lefebvre, founder of the Colorado Freedom School, Lane continuously refused to have the essay republished, claiming she needed time to update and revise it. Her most important contribution to political thought was thus out of a print for nearly 30 years, until it was republished posthumously in 1972 by the newly founded Libertarian Party. Lane's adopted grandson, lawyer Roger Leigh McBride, later ran for United States President in 1976 on the Libertarian Party ticket. He also authored 3 additional Little House books and co-produced the TV series. Throughout her life, Lane downplayed her role in establishing the Little House franchise, even as its success allowed her the financial freedom to support causes she believed in and pursue the political writing for which she hoped most to be remembered. Perhaps that it's best she didn't live to see her nightmare childhood replayed for millions of Americans in the spin-off series Little House, A New Beginning, nor would she likely enjoyed the various lawsuits surrounding the Laura Ingalls Wilder estate. Lane's final trip as a freelancer for Women's Day was to Vietnam in 1965 when she was 78 years old. Lane worked her themes of independence and Americanism into that final piece, attributing to Major Nigel Major Wynne, be a quote encapsulating the personal beliefs she'd spent decades espousing, beliefs one can't help but think were shaped by her hard-scrabble pioneer's days on the prairie. We stay, we survive, because freedom is right, and right is everlasting. Oh, and Amy Madsen Lauters is an assistant professor in the Department of Mass Communications at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and editor-author of the rediscovered writings of Rose Wilder Lane, literary journalist. Well, I hope you enjoyed this today, and it just was to talk about and to learn. I learned something about history today. I hope you did too. Thanks.